Hello, you're about to watch an episode of Newscast we recorded mid-afternoon on Wednesday, where friends of the podcast reacted to Rachel Reeves's budget and answered your questions about what was in it and what it means. So here is what was a live episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
We're going to respond to Rachel Reeves's budget, which she delivered at 12:30. She spoke for more than an hour. There's lots of stuff in there, but I think the big summary is that there's going to be big increases in taxes, quite big increases in borrowing, and that's to pay for some initially quite big increases in public spending, particularly on schools and hospitals. And the big tax increase is on employers' national insurance. So not necessarily the national insurance you might pay as an employee, but what your employer pays. And there's all sorts of other tweaks to taxes and extra announcements about spending as well. And you've been sending in your questions to us at newscast@bbc.co.uk, and you can carry on doing that throughout the day because we're going to record another episode later. And to answer your questions, you'll be pleased to hear it's not just me doing it. I'm going to have some expert help. Joining us from the Newscast studio at Westminster is Deputy Political Editor Vicky Young. Hello, Vicky.
Hi there, Adam.
How much is your head hurting?
Yeah, there's quite a lot there, isn't there? I mean, we knew quite a lot of it, but it's still hearing it is a different thing, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, and we've been told there'll be no rabbits out the hat, which is the terrible politics cliche for surprises, and there were a couple of surprises, but we'll come on to them in a bit. Also helping us is Felicity Hannah, who presents Moneybox on Radio 4 and has been presenting on 5 Live a lot the last few months. Hello, Felicity.
Hello.
How is your kind of analysis muscle doing?
Well,
Strong?
I have to say, because we were on air with Moneybox Live very, very shortly after the speech finished, and the Chancellor kept saying, and finally, and every time I was like, is this the finally? And every time she carried on going for well over an hour, I think. So my journalist instincts there were a little bit hurt.
Yeah, she basically was doing and finally for each section that she was doing, and then there'd be another section. And also here in the studio, taking a little break from his spreadsheets, is Ben Zaranko from the Institute for Fiscal Studies think tank. Hello.
Hello.
Is it true you guys stay up all night so you can then publish a big analysis first thing tomorrow morning?
Not quite all night usually, but this was about 4 budgets in one, so my bedtime is not looking good.
That's the theme is just big, isn't it? That's why I said the word big several times in that little introduction there.
That's the technical term.
That's what economists would say.
Yeah.
Right. So you've sent in your questions. You can continue to do that. You can also email us at bbcyourvoice@bbc.co.uk. And there's a WhatsApp number as well, which is 07980 682 727. But before we go to your questions, I'm just going to get the Brains Trust here to give us their kind of overall thoughts. Ben, what's the sort of way for you of summing up what you heard today?
I think there's 2 big planks to today. And I think the first is big tax rises to pay for some genuinely big increases in funding for public services, especially this year and especially next year. But after that point, not that much more cash. So there's a gamble there that they can turn things around quickly, get NHS waiting lists down, sort out the crisis in prisons, and then they can slow down the rate at which money's going in.
So sort of turn the tap on quite hard and then...
So more of a dribble, more of a dribble by the middle end of the parliament. And then the second big thing was well trailed in advance, but this big borrowing programme to pay for more investment, the public investment in bridges, railways, new hospitals, energy pylons that this government thinks are central to their growth agenda. And we had some more detail on that today. It is big, perhaps not quite as big as you might have expected, but a genuinely big change of policy direction.
Felicity, what's your big take? To use the word big again. I'm just saying the word big. It's like a trailer for the film Big.
I did see it called a big bazooka budget. I think what really interested me when the Chancellor started speaking was this double message. One, that she was going to raise £40 billion in taxes, definitely big, but also that she was planning to put more money in people's pockets. And I had a sort of furrowed brow thinking, I don't know how you managed to do that. And it is quite interesting to look at some of the things that she's done to make people feel like perhaps there might be some light at the end of the tunnel, but also to raise this massive amount of money that she needs. So quite simply, she's not targeting kind of everyday people with her tax rises. And that might give some people the sense they got away lightly. The freeze and fuel duty being kept around, for example, that might make people feel like they've got a bit more cash in their pockets than they thought they would have. We know that business is going to end up paying about half, maybe a bit more than half of the tax rises that we're seeing. Then there are some moves like minimum wage going up to £12.21 an hour, which of course does also mean you get more tax and national insurance into the Treasury. I think for me, the biggest things that I spotted were moving pension pots into inheritance tax. Now, people just very often don't really engage with their pension savings, with their pension pots, but these were effectively, they could be passed on to your heirs tax-free. They're going to move into inheritance tax now. And so I think that a lot more tax will be raised that way. And we talked about rabbits out of the hats, that terrible cliche. I think that the rabbit that was there was probably the unfreezing of those tax thresholds. So fiscal drag is when, as people earn more, as their pay goes up year on year, they get dragged into a higher tax bracket. And we know that they're going to stay frozen. The Conservatives had planned to have them frozen until 2028. The Chancellor's going to keep that, so they'll stay frozen for another 3 years. But after that, they'll unfreeze. And so people might feel like that's a bit of a rabbit out of the hat, maybe a slightly small, slightly bedraggled rabbit, but some light at the end of the tunnel.
Vicky?
I think the words very near the beginning of her statement, change must be felt, she said. And I think that would explain why you're having this sort of splurge in spending at the beginning of the Parliament, because I think the government realised that if they're going to take this much tax, this huge amount of tax that they're going to take, people will want to see change and they will want to see improvements in their public services. So what the government's doing is they are assessing that people, when they voted at the last election, were voting in the way that they were because they felt fed up with the fact that things don't work anymore. Public services need more money, and you can see there a huge amount of it, £22 billion over 2 years, going into the National Health Service. So they need some quick hits, if you like. They want to try and bring those waiting lists down, because that is people's lived experience. Everyone knows someone who's waiting for something on the NHS. So if they can start to deal with that, they can say, yeah, look, I know I had to take these taxes and I'm blaming that on the Conservatives, but look, it's working and I'm getting things moving, I'm getting things improved.
I've got 3 quick points I'll make before I then fire other people's questions at you. And Ben, maybe you can respond to all these 3 things. Number one, when you look at the document published by the Office of Budget Responsibility, because they published their big fiscal outlook alongside this, and it's a lovely light blue book with lots of graphs and charts in it, their predictions for what the growth rate of the economy is going to be over the next 5 years is they've increased their predictions for the next 2 years, but then decreased the potential rate of growth after that. And that to me does not seem like a ringing endorsement of Keir Starmer's mission to get economic growth going. The second thing is also buried in the OBR document. They talk about this measure called real household disposable income, which is a measure of just, well, kind of the name says it all. It's like how much money you've got to spend. It looks like living standards will increase a bit over the next 2 years, and then they'll be flat for a few years after that. So that's not people feeling that they've got more money to spend. And then my third observation is maybe one for Vicky, and it's based on what you just said, Vicky, which is that it's a bit of a hostage to fortune politically to say, we're doing all this stuff now that you might find a bit hard or a bit difficult, but it's worth it for the long term. That doesn't leave you a lot of wiggle room if it doesn't work, or there's some crisis blows in from somewhere else that needs to be responded to. And actually, yeah, it's a little potential hostage to fortune. So, Ben, do you want to do those first 2, the static ones? Growth and living standards.
Growth first. That's a fair summary you gave. So the OBR think that the extra borrowing to be pumped into more spending in the short term will provide some sort of sugar rush to the economy, if you like. And then as the Parliament goes on, that wears off, the tax rises start to really bite, and actually you end up more or less with no impact on growth. But the OBR think that in the long term, and this government have talked a lot about governing for the long term, a decade of renewal they talk about, they think the public investment that's been announced today will start to bring benefits, but probably not until the early 2030s was their assessment. If you build new railways, it takes a while to get them in place. It takes a while for people to start using them. If you think about new energy infrastructure, you can't just magic that into being overnight. So that will take time. So it's a short-term versus a long-term thing, and I suppose that's why they're seeking some short-term wins elsewhere. On living standards, it's sort of the same, but it's really related to these tax rises, is because the increase might be in employers' national insurance. It might not be seen directly on your payslip. It might not be felt directly or paid by the employee, but they will bear some of that. The OBR think that about 3/4 will be passed through in the form of lower wages. Some firms might see the big increase in employer national insurance, changes in regulations, increases in the minimum wage, and maybe even hire fewer people. So individuals, households will suffer some of the costs of that. And as the Parliament goes on, that's why. And I think that's one contributing factor to the falling living standard forecast, though they are still expected to grow.
Right. And Vicky, just that political point about, I mean, Keir Starmer, he said at his press conference the other day there, or at least hinted it. It's like, oh yeah, there wouldn't really have to be any more tax rises after these ones.
No, and we asked Darren Jones that actually a little bit earlier about will you be coming back for more? And he said no. The whole point is that this is it. This is the plan. We're going to fill in the black holes and then it's going to work. I mean, it's interesting. The other aspect of this, particularly the money going to the NHS, there's a 10-year NHS plan coming, but it's not coming until the spring. But they're giving them, a lot of money up front before they've got that. So the other question is, are they going to get anything back in terms of reform of the NHS? Because, during the election, Wes Streeting, the health secretary now, talked a lot about it's not just about money. It's not about the bottomless pit, just putting more money in and it just getting spent and maybe wasted. It's about reform and changing the way we work. Have they got any of that in place about what those reforms will be? Can they, improve productivity before they spend that cash? It's a lot of money to get through before you actually see the broader 10-year plan for the NHS.
And also the thing about NHS spending is a lot of that is gobbled up by decisions about staffing that have already been made, whether it is the pay rises for doctors and nurses that have been agreed with the unions, or whether it's the long-term NHS staffing plan that Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt came up with a year or so ago. Right, Felicity, we've got a question for you from Kerry on WhatsApp, who's a bit confused reading the BBC News website about national insurance, because Kerry has seen things going up, namely the rate, things going down, the thresholds, and then this allowance for the number of employees that allows some companies to reduce their liability for national insurance going up by quite a lot. So Kerry's like, how is there up? Just explain the different ups and downs within the broad heading of national insurance for employers.
Yeah, it was a bit of a hokey-cokey for national insurance, wasn't it? Things going in and things going out. So yes, national insurance contributions for employers are going to rise. They're going up from 13.8% to 15%. So a pretty substantial increase for employers paying for their staff. And so that's what's going up. The thing that's going to come down is the threshold at which businesses start paying national insurance on a worker's earnings. So that's going to be lowered. That was just over £9,000. That's coming down to £5,000. So they'll be paying a higher rate of national insurance, and they'll be paying it sooner on their workers' wages. And then smaller businesses have this employment allowance that kind of helps them manage the cost of things like national insurance. And employment allowance is going to increase. So that's the thing that's going up. That's going up from £5,000 to £10,500. And the Chancellor says that means that 865,000 employers won't be paying any national insurance at all next year. So that's to kind of protect the smallest businesses from really being clobbered by a massive hike in their national insurance. But as we've just been hearing, a rise in national insurance for businesses, it doesn't show up on a worker's payslip, but it can ultimately have an impact on that worker.
And of course, Vicky, that's how the government and people like Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, you were interviewing on BBC Two straight after Rachel Reeves' statement, can say, no, our manifesto, we're still sticking to our manifesto to not increase rates of national insurance paid by working people.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem they've got with this is that, yes, I suppose if you did a close textual analysis of the manifesto, you could look at that and say, well, yeah, you could read that as saying that they are clearly leaving it open to employers' national insurance going up. I think the problem is that lots of people obviously didn't read the manifesto. We obviously did. We obviously asked lots of Labour politicians about all of this. But in other interviews, they talked a lot about having no plans to put up taxes beyond the ones that they mentioned, which were the non-doms and private school fees, putting VAT on there. They were pretty limited. And there's lots of footage and lots of interviews with them making it clear, we have no plans to do any of that. So they, of course, can talk about the Conservatives not being honest about what it was going to cost, some of the things that they didn't budget for. And it's certainly the case that the Conservatives did not. If you look at the compensation scheme for infected blood, for example, we're talking about huge amounts of money here, over £11 billion compensation for that. So it's certainly the case that a bulk of that would have had to have been spent by the Conservatives. They probably would have been sitting here today if they were in power and having to put up taxes in some way, maybe not to this extent. So I think they do have a slight problem there with trust, that it just sounds like they're just trying to wriggle around, over one word. And so I think, that is the problem they're going to have. How much goodwill is there from the voter about this? If you'd watched most of the interviews of Labour politicians during the election, you would have thought they've got no plans to put up, let alone they certainly didn't stand there and say we're going to put up taxes by £40 billion. So it's whether voters actually think, I actually believe them, and I actually agree that it was the Conservatives that left this legacy, this dire legacy that Labour call it. And that's why they're having to do this now. But they will still have to produce the results. I think that's what's going to sway voters at the next election.
Politicians wriggling around about words. Whatever next? Patrick messaged the WhatsApp group for Newscast saying, what does the increase in national insurance for employers mean for the NHS? And Patrick, I can answer that, because basically the government is exempting public sector organisations from that. And that means that the national insurance increase raises about £5 billion a year less eventually than it would have done if that exemption hadn't been included. Right. Some people are also messaging us on the BBC Live page, including Ross from Bristol. Felicity, what's changing about stamp duty?
Okay, so stamp duty, and this change comes into force tomorrow, so very little opportunity for people to get round it. Stamp duty on second homes, so investment properties, holiday properties, that kind of thing. Not your first home, but your second home, if you're buying one, or third or fourth. That is going up tomorrow to 5%, so that's going to be quite a significant increase. And I was chatting to a landlord in Moneybox Live who was saying, well, do you know what? I'm out. If I can't add any more properties to my books with this extra stamp duty cost, and so he was planning to buy no more. And there's some speculation, of course, that will benefit first-time buyers. And in fact, in the budget today, we also heard that first-time buyers are going to carry on being exempt from stamp duty when they're buying a house worth up to £425,000. So some benefits potentially for first-time buyers, landlords, and anybody who wants to buy a holiday cottage, maybe feeling slightly less upbeat about it. One thing we did kind of touch upon as well, though, of course, is that if landlords' costs are going up, what do? They put the rent up. And so there's the potential for rents to go up, which, of course, will stop would-be first-time buyers from potentially being able to raise as much of a deposit, because they'll be paying that little bit more in rent.
And Vicky, that is related to some of the other changes in the budget, which show that the Labour government, wanted to put taxes up on people who have what's known as unearned income. So inheritance, say, of like, if you're a farmer and you want to pass your land onto your kids, or you've got a very big pension pot and you die and you want to pass that on to your kids, actually the tax, let's call it the tax person, rather than the tax man, will be taking more of that in future.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of speculation about inheritance tax. And again, maybe like we've talked about, there being no surprises. But I think there were some who thought that Rachel Reeves might have gone a bit further on inheritance tax. So there was speculation about whether the so-called 7-year rule, where you can hand over some money, live 7 years, and then it doesn't qualify for inheritance tax, that she might have extended that to 10 years or abolished it or whatever. So none of that has happened. But there are exemptions on the agricultural land. I think it's if it's worth under £1 million, then you will be exempt. But there'll be lots of people who would consider themselves working farmers whose land is worth more than that, who now won't be able to hand that on. So the pension pot as well, again, I suppose they will argue that this is just bringing it in line with why should some people not be paying inheritance tax. So if you've got a pension pot and you hand it over, you've obviously got the tax benefits of having that pension pot in the first place, and then you can hand it on to people and you don't pay any inheritance tax. Well, that's going to go as well. So it's little things here and there which add up to just a couple of billion here and there, which is bringing it up to this total that we've heard about from her.
And there's a new charge on passengers on private jets, so bear that in mind next time you book a PJ for your holiday. Right, Ben, which I've never done, by the way. I don't even know how you do. Feel free to message in if you know how to do that. Not that I've got any plans to do it. Right, Ben, this is a question for you, and it comes via a voice note, and it is from Guy in Hampshire.
Hi Newscast. My question is about the £22 billion black hole. Rishi Sunak says that the OBR report didn't mention it. Did the OBR validate the Chancellor's claims?
Yeah, so just the background to this is Rachel Reeves stood up in July and said, I've looked at the books. There's loads of unfunded commitments left by the last government that they weren't honest about. It amounts to a £22 billion black hole. But we journalists call it the so-called black hole because there are some question marks around it. The Office of Budget Responsibility did a separate little report today because they did an investigation into what they'd been told or not told about the previous government's spending plans. What actually did the OBR end up saying, Ben?
The OBR at a high level said there's some of this we should have been told about in March. In March, there was overspending going on in the asylum system. There was costs of public sector pay awards that the government knew about, the Treasury knew about, and the Treasury were aware that the budgets for this year probably weren't going to be able to meet those. They have this reserve built in, it's sort of like an unallocated buffer, like a rainy day fund almost, that had already been spent elsewhere. They knew there were going to be troubles, and the OBR weren't aware. So the OBR are quite unhappy about that. It's worth saying as well that is less than half of the 22 billion. And big chunks of the 22 billion are due to decisions that in some sense this government made about increasing public sector pay and about other things that they chose to carry on with. And so it's not, if this was a boxing match, it wouldn't be a knockout win. It would be a sort of maybe win by points. But there is clearly something there that didn't go right in the March budget. And the main crux of this is there's new rules about how the Treasury and the OBR interact to stop it happening again.
Yeah, and it's nuanced. And when there's nuance, that means both sides can argue whatever they want and quote it selectively, which is actually what's happened this afternoon. Right. There's a question for you, Felicity, from Chanel, and it's about the £2 bus cap going up to £3. Do we know what sort of calculations have gone into, keeping the bus cap at all, but also putting it up by, 50%?
Yeah, people are really upset about the bus cap. I think it's made a huge difference. In fact, if you look at some of the routes that this bus cap has, it's taken effect across all of them, but on some of the routes, that saved people as much as 80% of their fare. So it's been really, really significant capping it at £2. I would say it was due to end entirely in December. It was only planned to run until December. So although, yes, it's going from £2 a journey to £3 a journey, it is actually being extended into next year. And for a while, perhaps that wasn't on the cards. In terms of how much it's going to cost to extend it, we know that the government is spending £151 million extending the cap until the end of 2025. So that's 151 million quid, even with the cap going up to £3. So keeping it at £2, it would have gone up even more. I think that, people, particularly in rural communities, have really relied on this cap. But in some senses, it's a bit of a relief that it's going on for another 12 months.
T. Haslam asks a very technical but very good question, which is, why does the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, allow some pretenses in their supposedly independent forecasts? And what T is getting at there, Ben, is the fact that every year chancellors continue the freeze on fuel duty. And in this case, Rachel Reeves has also continued the 5p temporary discount. However, the OBR's projections for future years' spending include fuel duty going up by inflation, which no chancellor ever does. Why, as a political and fiscal and economic establishment, is that allowed to happen?
Though the boring answer is because the OBR by law has to take government policy as given. They're not allowed to start supposing, what if the government did this instead? Because it would lead them into some dangerous places. So they have to take the government's word for it. The problem is the government's word for it is worth nothing. And they can say they're going to do things that they have no intention of doing, and the OBR have to faithfully plug those in. It's a shambles, to be honest. And it also, the 5p cut relates to another question relating to the bus cap, which is when a government announces a temporary policy, it's really hard to undo some of those sometimes. And temporary policies have a habit of becoming permanent.
Because people notice things being taken away.
They do indeed. And so there's questions about how those are dealt with in the forecasting process. But yeah, the fuel duty thing really is a shame. This government's made a big deal about being honest with the British people, although only post-election, I know, and embracing the trade-offs and not trying to fiddle the numbers in the way that they allege the previous government did. This is an unfortunate continuing of a bad practice.
Although, it's a sort of tradition rather than a particularly Rachel Reevesian move, isn't it? Yes. Also, Vicky, the fuel duty policy, which was a bit of a surprise, along with the other surprise of 1p off a pint in a pub, presumably that's designed so that at least half of the Sun front page tomorrow is good.
Not sure it's going to be, actually, but yeah, I suppose that's the case. And there are these questions about things like the fuel duty and, how long do you carry that on for? I think, like you say, it's something that's just happened. I think it's since George Osborne froze it, didn't he, in 2010, the fuel duty. And, it's just gone on, and it's like no one feels they can touch that. So, I think there's an argument to be made. She could have made an argument, couldn't she, on environmental grounds about fuel duty potentially going up. But yeah, £3 billion, I think she said it's costing. And she's decided to keep it. But there's definitely a question there, I think. Yeah, it must just coming under huge pressure from presumably MPs with rural constituencies, of course, of which there are more now for Labour, that this was just going to be, and potentially another hit on employers. So if, you've got companies that, move stuff around, deliver stuff, that would be a huge hit on them at the time when she's already putting up the national insurance. So, I think that was the reasoning behind that.
And one last big kind of intellectual question for you, Ben, and a few people have mentioned this while we're all talking about national insurance. Why not just bundle national insurance into income tax, so there's just one thing there?
Short version, we should. If you were a reforming chancellor, if you wanted to go down well with the fiscal nerds in the history books, it's the sort of thing you would look at. I think
not enough of them to win elections, though. I don't think is that
very much not. I think so. The reason why they're separate is basically historical accident. There's no world in which if you started again, you'd have one income tax based on your annual income, and national insurance based on your weekly earnings, only earnings from work, not income from, say, shares or rent. And it's silly. But I think the one big reason why it would be politically challenging to merge them is at the moment, if you get most of your income from a pension, as lots of old people do, you don't pay national insurance on that. And if you merged the two, let's say you just added them together, say basic rate 20% income tax plus 12% national insurance, or 8% now, so that's 28. That would be a big increase in the tax rate facing a pensioner. Pensioners do vote, fiscal nerds might not, but pensioners do. And so that is one reason why I think chancellors shy away.
Well, a very interesting point on which to end. Ben, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Felicity, lovely to see you.
Thank you.
And Vicky, great to catch up with you too.
Thank you very much.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast, where we answered your questions and mine about the budget. We will be recording another episode of Newscast on Wednesday evening, where Chris Mason, our political editor, Faisal Islam, our economics editor, and Darshini David, our chief economics correspondent, will give their analysis after having a good few hours to read all the many, many, many documents that come along with the budget. And that's available on BBC Sounds.
Newscast from the BBC.